like I said to the folks that were on early, you can download the slides at this tiny URL. So feel free to do so. It's not like it's give me your email or anything like that. Just grab it and download it and use it how you'd like. And of course, thank you, sponsors. And of course, many of these names are very familiar. Pragmatic and 280 Group are very familiar across the product camps. And of course, the Texas McCombs Master of Science and Technology. I actually looked at that too. I was curious when I saw that because I saw the email ahead of time and I had to take a look, and it looks like if it was 20 years ago, I'd say, oh, that looks like an interesting program at this point in my career, but depending where you're in your career, that may be of interest to you. So a little bit about me. I'm a person that's lived in a lot of places, have not lived in Texas yet, although I've been there a lot. I'm actually living in Minnesota now, but I'm actually in the process of moving to Tennessee. And hopefully by the end of next month, we'll be down in the Nashville area. So a little bit farther south out of Minnesota winter. We actually had snow this week here in Minnesota a little bit. So I'm happy to depart. I used to be an organic chemist, and then I became an attorney. Yeah. Both weird things, not common paths to product. But when I got into product, I got into catastrophe modeling. And so and it was actually more on the casualty side where I started out, but then got into like hurricane and other types of modeling from a product perspective. Then, of course, moving, one of the things I like to do is like to travel, not just move. So I the last couple of years have been a little harder with not as much travel, but I'm also a big fan of product camps. So I've actually been to a number of product camps, including Product Camp Austin, like Matt said, we've been down there together before. In fact, that's how Matt and I met. And of course, I met Roger and many other great folks from down there in Austin. And so we have Product Camp up here in the Twin Cities too, where I'm at currently. And so I've been the organizer, the chair of Product Camp Twin Cities for the last 6 or 7 years. So no Product Camp well, I really like it and glad everyone's staying on till the end of the day. So you would get the gold star from me. Okay, so AI and ML, let's just like have a really, we're not going to get all picky on names, but I think it's just good to hear a little bit more what these terms are to just, reinforce this, especially if you're a person that's not used to AI and ML. So artificial intelligence is the capability of a computer system mimicking human cognitive capability and functions. Now, oftentimes what you'll hear is neural nets, right? That's or deep learning. Those two terms you'll hear quite a bit out there, and that's usually what people are meaning when they're talking about artificial intelligence. And those are pretty much the best in the market nowadays for doing a lot of things like whether you're doing textual stuff or whether you're doing facial recognition or those other things that are out there. Those neural nets are very popular. And then there's also this category called machine learning. And machine learning is simply an application of AI where models are how they're basically, you don't have to program it. So traditionally when you would do analytics, let's say if you had a conversational bot. And so for a long time, what these conversational bots, they're not new. They've been around for many decades, ever since really early internet, where it would just be rules based. So, okay, if this person says this, I do this. If this person says that, they choose an option, then goes to this. And then if they say these two words, I'm going to say this. And so because of that, that was something that was very hard to program and upkeep. And when you think of machine learning, what you're doing in essence is you're letting the computer reinforce itself. Now, sometimes that there's other data that's coming in to help in that reinforcement. Oftentimes they're based on the user's actions. But machine learning is think of it as more complex. The computer is sort of programming itself in essence after it's running. Okay. That's a little simplified, of course, for the purists, but go with that. So we're going to talk about 10 tips today. And like I say, I'd love to hear any more that people have. And some of these are things that are like, okay, yeah, obvious. Some things maybe not as obvious. And so you have to tell me which you find. So just like anything in product, you're always identifying the right problem, right? Now, the challenge is I think oftentimes when people get into AI or ML, they're always looking for that really cool, really tough problem, really game changing. And yeah, if you're a startup that's going to make or break your startup based on some new revolutionary use of AI, then certainly that makes sense. But for a lot of organizations, whether it's even like, the 500 and up type person organization, That's just not the case. And oftentimes you just have to find the right problems that you're going to do. And we're going to talk about throughout these tips on how to identify those right tips. But the key is sort of oftentimes starting out really small. And so starting out those really small use cases that you can leverage AI to show a win. So you show value and then you keep on getting more investment in your organizations. Because I think right away people just have this misnomer and they're willing to spend a lot of money up front. Leaders are, because they have huge expectations, but then the ROI just they don't feel is there very quickly. And so to not put yourself in there as a product person, I'd say start really small when you're diving into this space. Okay, tip number 2, certainly data is critical and it's all about the data. And ideally you have data that's really proprietary and really game changing and you have lots of data, but it's not data by itself is not even just good enough, right? So you need to have, for oftentimes there's a concept called supervised learning versus unsupervised learning. Supervised learning is where you have data and that you actually have the indicator. So let's say a classic example is a cat versus dog. So I have a bunch of pictures of cats and dogs and I've labeled, let's say I have 1,000 of them and I've labeled all 1,000 of those as cat versus dog. And now I can train a model based off those images because I have a supervised learning data set and I can use that. And it's a lot of the most common models that you'll see nowadays are in that supervised learning. There's also the concept of unsupervised learning where it will just look at those pictures of cats versus dogs and I'll try to segment it off in its own. But like you'll see is most things that I see in production are really in that labeled space, that supervised learning space. But in addition to the data that you're capturing, and of course you want to be capturing more and more data that is useful for problems that you're going to solve, because just throwing a bunch of data in there without thinking about the data itself is not a good way to go about things. So really being diligent at understanding the problems that you're trying to solve and what data are likely types of data that will help the model perform. And then of course, you're going to experiment and learn just like all things. But in addition, one of the things that really encourages people there's what's called ensemble modeling, where it's the combination of different models that you're bringing together. You're bringing together like linear regression and another, a random forest being brought together, and you're using those two models in tandem to come up with a better overall model. In addition, when you think about data, you should be thinking about that same way. Oftentimes, you don't have all the data, the best data. We know that. So where are the other sources? Who are the partners that you can work with where it's a win-win for everyone leveraging that data, and including public data? There's a lot of great public data that's being more and more available that you can leverage in addition to your own proprietary data to add more value and create better models that come about. In addition, leveraging existing models or solutions are one of the things that, 5 years ago, this wasn't as big of a thing, but nowadays this is more and more important. And the advantage is there's just so much stuff that's out there. There's so many models that you can leverage that somebody else has already done a lot of the hard work, or they've at least identified the solution, and you may still have to do some of it. And you have to do some what's called transfer learning, where you basically take a pre-built model that's there, and then you're just tuning it to some of the data that you have. But the good thing about that is you need less data to do that tuning because you've already started with that. So it's a less expensive investment to do that. But also at the same time, it's just, just easier. Like, it's you don't have to invest as much in all the equipment and things like that, but also all the complicated of all the things that they've learned from that. And so obviously there's the Googles, Facebooks, everyone it's got different models that can be licensed and used in different capacities. But also there's a lot of others. There's even a lot of open source type models that can be used. I mean, certainly not as many as there ideally will be, and I think this is getting to be more and more the case, but certainly looking at, what problems have already been solved, and you can go into the literatures and find that like what people have done to, for example, a classic one is recommendations. Like people with the recommendation systems, like that has been done to death. There's so many people that have done recommendation engines where, if you bought this, you should also buy this, or because you've done this, you should also do this. And so certainly that's a case where, you shouldn't be trying to boil the ocean. Probably in that case, you can add a lot of value to hopefully to your customer by building that, but also just doing it on the cheap and not thinking that that's going to be your primary differentiator. Okay, so let's go to tip number 4. baselines. So one of the things I think that's really important, especially, and in fact, I was just having this conversation this week with a client, is model baselines. And so really starting with the idea of, okay, we know the problem that we're trying to solve, but what is the level of confidence if we're going to leverage artificial intelligence and machine learning? What is that baseline that we need to start at? Like, if it's not at least 80% good, going to be identifying the right thing, is that the minimum that will allow a decent enough user experience that this would be any value? Because if the state of the art in the market is only 70% for this type of modeling, and we don't think we have any better data than anyone else, then why are we even wasting time on it? And I see a lot of people chasing problems that are just unwinnable problems from what they need for their end product. And so that's going to vary, like I say, drastically among the situations that you're trying to do and the type of modeling you're trying to do, but really starting with that really early on so that you don't just invest, because you can burn through a lot of money with expensive data scientists researching around. They'll keep on making it as good as they can make it, but often it tops out at a certain point with the current state of the art. Okay, let's go on to tip number 5. I feel like I'm here's the top 10 list. Okay, of course, this one, the model bias is something that you hear in the news, and a lot of people I feel are dunking on this a little too much. And I think, I'm going to dunk on the Microsoft Taybot, because I actually think Microsoft does a lot of great other things. But of course, the Taybot that came out, which was a chatbot, I think it took like 16, 17 hours to become just outright saying racist comments, saying sexist things, saying just like downright offensive things, because a bunch of trolls got on there, and it was a standard type of, I mean, it wasn't standard, it was, I'm sure, very complicated, but it was a neural net that was being interacted with. And because of that, it kept on learning. It was doing what it was supposed to do. It was learning from how people interacted with it. And if you have a bunch of people that are interacting with a bunch of racist comments and other comments, then it's going to all of a sudden think that's the norm and I should act that way. And so certainly that's a story that gets mentioned a lot. But I think there's a lot of areas where you start asking, like, most decisions, most things that we do have some bias in it, whether it's hiring, whether it's other things, there is bias that tends to exist, right? So really understanding where bias can be occurring in you, certainly not only obviously in your data, because your models are based off your data, and there's ways to compensate that nowadays, where, okay, if all of a sudden, just because your historical basis, you have 80% of your data represented with men and 20% women, because your organization just has been a tech org and it's been very dominated that way. And so if you have it that way and you build a model off it on a hiring basis, likely that's going to still be the case unless you figure out ways to compensate for that. Of course, you can multiply out the data of the women that you have, the 20%, you can build up that data, or you can take a subset of the men data. There's different ways to go about doing this. But certainly thinking about those ways that bias can be built in by understanding your underlying data. And one of the things I encourage product managers to do is really, you got to, at least while you're not the data scientist clearly, but you do need to really understand your data, and you need to understand gaps in data when you're in this space of really building AI models, so that you can also have that good, healthy conversations with your data scientists, your data engineers, your data analysts, so that you can make sure that these things aren't happening and things are being caught early on, so that you don't end up in that bad state where all of a sudden you spend all this effort and you can't release the model because it's going to create a press release. Okay, so other things from a model bias. The other thing I always like, and this, I was hinting at this before, but I think people are looking for perfection, and we know that these models are going to be wrong, and they're going to be wrong in some way, probably one form or another. There's going to be some bias, but that's why you also have to build in those listening mechanisms to post when you're releasing models, that you're always trying to understand, hey, because models, one is it's not just set and forget it. You have to continually make sure they're being maintained and adjusted. And certainly some of that adjustment, it might be, okay, all of a sudden we see it delving off to this way, maybe it needs to be retrained, and we need to like adjust the data a little bit more because it clearly is going off to this one side. And so understanding that's something to make sure to do. But also at the same time, you also should understand the bias in your existing, the thing that you may, if you're going to replace something, what is the bias that you think's in the system already? And the more that you understand that, again, the more that you're going to be able to remove that model bias later, or before it begins. Okay, tip number 6, understand cause and effect. So a classic example is looking at pictures. And so image recognition is a very common thing in the current neural nets, and they do a fairly good job at it. It's much better than you would think. But sometimes you don't know why things are the way they are. And so this has been reproduced multiple times. And so taking a bunch of pictures of wolves and a bunch of pictures of huskies. And if you take a bunch of pictures of both of those, of wolves and huskies, you would say, okay, that's a pretty impressive thing, being able to identify the difference, because there's a lot of similarities between those two. But what if you take a bunch of pictures of huskies that are in the middle of grass and a bunch of wolves that are in the middle of snow, which is oftentimes where you see a lot of wolves, right? Where a lot of the pictures occur. And so by doing that, it might not be actually doing it based on the wolf or the husky itself. It might be doing it on snow or grass and saying, okay, well, there's a much higher likelihood if I see the snow that it's a wolf versus the husky. And that's really the reason why it's making that decision. So again, there's a lot of things that you can do to try to better understand why it is. I mean, one of those things, of course, is having a more diverse representative data set is really critical. But also at the same time, there's different techniques that you can do to really understand why some of these more complex artificial intelligence and machine learning mechanisms are making the decision. So it can zero in on like which area of the image, for example, that it's making it on. Is it making it on because of the snow, or is it making it on because of the actual body and the head of the husky or the wolf? So again, one of those things, cause and effect, it's really important because it will minimize mistakes later. Okay, and the other thing, of course, this is where Andrew, I forgot his last name. He's out of Stanford and helped do Coursera. Andrew talks about building a data moat, and this is really important. And so the idea is, okay, if you're really going to try to create a really differentiated product or based on artificial intelligence or machine learning, a lot of that's going to be not because of the model itself. It's going to be because you built up a really good data moat that the result is that you have a much better model that's going to work better than others. But that means you have to figure out a way to build that self-reinforcing moat. And so thinking about how you can continuously make sure to add more data and ideally add more feedback into that data so that the model will even be better, will be tuned better, user behavior. So a user goes in and he says, oh, here's the 10 people I've recommended. Tell us which ones you want to connect with. Okay, just even like putting that on LinkedIn. LinkedIn does that with the recommendations right there. And every time you click on one of those, it's telling you something about saying, okay, we must have done a good job here, but you're not clicking on these, and we've showed you this for this long. So that's also something that it's telling LinkedIn when you're from a reinforcement basis. And so again, thinking about a way that you're building a product that's going to build that moat so that you're going to continue to have a differentiating thing. Now, of course, it's not as important if this product's not the really key pivotal thing for what your organization is doing. But if it is, then certainly thinking about how you're going to build that data moat into your process is really important. And let's go to number 8, look for experience opportunities. So one of the things certainly we know customer experience, user experience, these are things that just people are really buying and caring more about than ever before. And so even like I say, the classic example is, and people, I'm sure you've used the Alexa devices or Google Assistant or Siri or one of those types of chat bots or voice technologies. And those technologies are great, sure. But what we don't like is when we go to a site and they just allow us to have our only customer support with the organization is through a bot. And some of the sites that do this. And I get so frustrated, like you can't talk to a person, like you would have to go down to their office to actually like find somebody that you're actually going to be able to engage with, because they are going to just give you their documentation. They're going to give you the chatbot, and that's all you're going to get. And for them, that's certainly an efficient, cheap way to do it. And if you find something right away when you're looking for something, great, like that experience wasn't bad. But oftentimes I've just heard, and myself included, but many other people saying the same thing, like, how can I possibly get a hold of somebody? How can I possibly get a hold of somebody at Twitter, for example? Because they just can't find a way to actually do so and engage with people. And so one of the things is when you're thinking about building AI and ML, don't just look at it from a efficiency standpoint, think about how this plays into the experience of your users. And is this the way that we're doing this? And you can easily lie to yourself, because you can say, hey, if I make this perfect thing, it's going to be great. They're going to find all their questions. We're not going to need to have a customer support and call center. That's rarely the case. And so knowing that's rarely the case, thinking about how you build in that experience so that the overall, that this is sort of a yes and in the improv terminology to say, okay, this is going to improve the chatbot or voice technology is going to improve my customer's experience, in addition to still having a fallback way of getting customer support, for example, in a call center. Like I say, that's just one example, but you think of your AI and ML, how it fits into that overall user experience, and look for those opportunities and build it in a way that's good for the user, and you'll usually be well off. Okay, tip number 9, be transparent with your users. I like to use this example. I don't know if anyone in the chat, you want to put, have you ever seen the or used the first Microsoft or the first Amazon Halo? Anyone actually own it possibly? Or saw it when it came out? It came out a couple of years ago, the original one. They have the updated one that looks like it's coming out soon. I don't think it's out yet. But for me, I'm looking in the chat. No one's writing in the chat. Amazon Halo, when it came out, it was sort of weird. So it's like a Fitbit band, or like a, it's that type of fitness looking band, right? And except it's different in the sense it doesn't have the screen on it. But what it did is a few things. It monitored your voice, so use the voice technology to look for when you got upset or excited or did certain things, and it was doing some of that stuff. So it's like always listening, and it's not always listening. I think they did at certain intervals where, and some things, thresholds that it would listen, but it would give you feedback on that tied with your blood pressure and all the things, your heart rate and things like that, that it's able to detect. The other thing that did, which is I think the thing that got the most creepy when I looked at it was saying, oh, like just like take a picture of yourself in your underwear, and we can show how healthy you'll be if you'll look different you're at this weight now, and if you get down to this weight, or if you know what you'll look like. And we promise we'll get rid of it in 18 hours on our servers. Now the good thing is they said all this, and I think they got a lot of stuff in the media, because people, when they saw this, they're like, what, who in the world would do this? And I'm sure, sorry if any of you had, and you don't think it's a big deal, but for me right away, I was like, there's no way something that's always listening and wants me to take a picture of my underwear, like that's not going to be the thing that I'm buying. At the same time, they are very transparent with me as a user, that I didn't feel worse about Amazon. I laughed about it. I use them as an example, but I also am using it as a good example here, in the sense that they were very transparent and like, hey, this is what we're doing. This is what we promised we'll do. And there's no evidence to say that they weren't doing what they said they were doing. And now they've evolved, they've learned, and they've come out with their new iteration of the Halo. And actually with the new iteration, I'm like, oh, this looks a lot better. Okay, I'm looking at actually buying it when it comes out. So I think it's interesting enough to try. That's supposed to come out, I think, later this year. But again, being transparent with me allows me to trust that I will trust that company. And I think too often people are just using customer data in their models in ways, and they're not really thinking about from the end user as a, hey, am I communicating with them? Am I communicating the value I'm doing? Hey, if you provide me more data, great. The reason why you're providing me more data allows me to do this, and allow them to make that choice, whether they can do that or not. So, okay, tip number 10, of course, looking for win-win-win scenarios. One of the classic examples, and when I say win-win scenarios, I mean, is it good for the business? Is it going to generate revenue, right? Is it good for the customer experience, right? Certainly that's important. And is it good? Is it just good ethical use of data, and how you're doing it in a way that's transparent and all that? So one example I like to use is, so you see this often used a lot, and mine is blanking, of course, is predictive maintenance. So predictive maintenance is something that's very common. It's very core. People, from a predictive maintenance standpoint, when your washer is going to break down, or when truck's going to break down, this predictive maintenance is something that is very doable based on if you have good data. But it also brings up a ton of new business models that you can do as a product manager. So if you're able to collect some data, let's say you're a lawnmower company, and you're now trying to understand, okay, when's a lawnmower going to break down? And I'm going to build in a warranty plan based on it. And I'm also going to build in we can rebuy your thing, and we can have the data underlying, and we can provide more confidence to the next user. All those things are beneficial. But also me as an end user, I also don't get stuck with a lawnmower that's going to get broken down when I need to actually cut the grass. It says, hey, like this is happening, this is about to happen. Here, we can send you this part, that's going to be here. Or we can have a service appointments add down the road, and this is how much it'll be. Again, that's just a new business model. And for me, it's helpful because I'm not outside with a lawnmower and a bunch of grass that I just got half cut. So again, thinking about those opportunities for those win-win-win scenarios with AI and ML is just key. And so with that, those are the 10 tips. And so I have them again here. I always like to recommend a few things, and this one is not strictly AI ML, but I think it's just a really good book for related to analytics and product managers is Infonomics. It's one I recommend. Podcast. Now, if you're getting really nerdy on this, then certainly Twilmo AI, I think it's a really good podcast. I mean, people like Mark Cuban and others have said really good things about it too, and I think he does a really good job. Some of these will get pretty in the weeds with machine learning and AI. So some of these you'll be like, not as much. Some you'll like. VoiceBot, if you're into the chat or the voice technologies, great. A series of many great interviews. In fact, one I'd recommend is his interview with the BBC's person. I forgot who the person's name was or what the person's exact role was, but how they use voice technology, chat technology within the BBC, I thought was really good. And then Data Skeptic, Kyle, and what they do at the Data Skeptic, a lot of great things. And again, some of them will get pretty nerdy, some of it won't be so much. If you're into online courses, AI for Everyone is a good course. That's by Andrew, the one gentleman I was talking about earlier. It's really quick. You can audit Coursera courses. You don't even have to spend any money, or if you want to, you can get the certificate, that kind of thing. And it's a few bucks. I forgot what it costs. Of course, you can download the presentation, but if there's any questions, I mean, feel free to email me or connect with me on LinkedIn or whatever, but I'm not on social media that much anymore. So LinkedIn or Twitter, I have accounts, but it may be delayed getting to you. So any questions does anyone have? I know we have like 2 minutes remaining. Didn't leave as much time for questions, even though, thank you for letting me know the 5 minutes. I knew I was running a couple minutes late.
Hey, Dave.
Hey.
Thanks so much for the presentation. I'm new to the community. I'm a student at UT at the Information Technology program out of McCombs. And I come from a non-technical background, but we've been learning a lot about data science, machine learning, and it's a lot. It's a lot to take in coming from a non-technical background. As I'm kind of looking forward to product management and thinking about all the things that you've mentioned, I'm curious if you foresee any I'm curious if you have any input on big trends to follow or spaces within the AI ML space that a budding product manager might focus on to sort of, be ahead of the curve.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because you can really go down the rabbit hole here. So I try not, because I probably go down that rabbit hole too much. I'll be bluntly honest. And so I do think usually taking a look at signing up, and there's actually, what's that new company, Inkle, I think Inkle, right, is a new company out of the UK that they have a lot of subscriptions with things. And I'm not sure if they're signed up with HBR or some of those typical businessy journals. I always say those get there a little late. I think depending on your company, for example, if your company is using voice technologies a lot, then I'd be definitely like VoiceBot you should be using, or if things are like in the VR AR space, there's things I would recommend. So there's so many different things that I think are out there, but I think usually taking a look at the typical business journals and seeing what they're saying in artificial intelligence and McKinsey's and those that come out with things is usually a healthy place to just sort of have a broad grasp of things, but also you're not going to dive in too much. But I do think and I encourage executives, I mean, even some folks at a pretty senior level, I've recommended the AI for Everyone course, where it's like, no, you should take this, and here's why I think it'll benefit you. And I think there's things like that are just jumpstart things, but to sort of stay up on things, I think just the typical business journals until you get to okay, I really need to stay up on, IoT related stuff. And I'd say, okay, if it's IoT and analytics, then there's a couple of things that I would recommend, but there's so many different segments that there's just too many to cover everything, or else you'll be like me and spend way too many time watching videos and listening to podcasts.